So what would you, in a nutshell, describe the meaning crisis as? Where did it come from, and what do you think we should do about it?
Well, the title is actually very appropriate, so I'm looking forward to this discussion because I think there's deep connections between the topic of wisdom and the topic of meaning in life. Very deep and I think profound and important. So I actually often introduce the meaning crisis via the topic of wisdom. So let me try that because I think it might also give us some initial common ground that we can connect on. So here's an idea. I'm going to take it for granted that people will grant me good faith that most of my claims are backed up by extensive argument and evidence elsewhere that I've put out because my series is 50 hours long and
Sure.
I'm not going to be able to. Right, let me do the whole argument right now. That's not going to happen. So the basic idea is that cognition. The very processes that make us a cognitive agent, they're dynamically self-organizing processes. We can get a little bit more into what that means, but basically you can think of that there's a loop between you and the world, and what you're doing is you're shaping that loop in various ways in order to zero in on the relevant information and ignore the irrelevant information. This, by the way, turns out to be, I've argued extensively with other people, by the way, that this, I think, is the core of our general intelligence. It's the ability that we're finding very, very difficult to give to AI to make it into genuine artificial general intelligence. So when I'm talking about meaning, I don't want you to. I mean, it's a metaphor. We're using like what a sentence has. That's a proposition, right? And the way a sentence coheres together and links us in the world. I want you to think of it. And this is how we talk about it in psychology when we talk about meaning in life. I want to mean more how you're making sense of things. What's standing out for you? What's backgrounded for you? What aspect you're seeing me under? What identity you're assuming in correspondence? That's what I'm talking about, that whole machinery by which your cognitive agency is shaping you so that you can be what we are. We're general problem solvers. We can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains. And so this process is dynamic, it's self-organizing. And what it's doing is, and this sounds almost like a Zen koan, it's making you intelligent by having you ignore most of the information in your environment. Because you can't do this. You can't check it all, and all the information, by the way, in your long-term memory, and see if it's relevant. That's combinatorial explosive. No machine, no supercomputer could even approximate that. So what you do is you're doing what you're doing right now. You're probably focusing on me and my face, and you weren't thinking about your left big toe until I said your left big toe, for example, right? But if it started hurting, then you would shift your attention. Now, that is like, again, I'm just going to have to hope that people will take me on good faith. That is like the core ability. And notice how it's a living connection. I'm not talking about, grasping a proposition. I'm talking about the way you are in a living dynamic connection with your environment. Now, it's the core of what makes you intelligent. The problem with it is the very thing that makes you intelligent makes you susceptible to self-deception. So, right, let me give you an example, a concrete example. If I were to play chess and I tried to calculate all the possible sequences of movements, I couldn't do it. Not even the fastest computers do it that way. So what do? We tend to focus. We focus on the center board. We focus on our king. But we can still lose. I beat somebody not that long ago because I noticed that they were focusing on the center board and their king, and I played a peripheral game where I pretended to be threatening their king, and then I knocked out their queen, and etc. Right? Do you see what I mean? Right? And so so these are all of our cognitive biases. We have all of these ways of focusing our attention, and when it focuses, we say, "Oh, that's intelligent." But when it biases our attention, it's the very same process, but we say, "Oh, it biased our attention." So, for example, you can take a look in just as one example. People tend to only look for information that confirms a belief they're testing. This just feeds into the echo chambering in social media. Okay, now I'll get there very shortly. Thank you for sticking with me. Okay, so across cultures and across history, people have figured out this perennial problem of self-deception. Self-destructive, other destructive, self-deceptive behavior. And what they've done is they've created ecologies of practices. Because this is a complex dynamical system, you can't just intervene on it, but, oh, I'll just start believing this, or, well, yeah, do it sometime. Just that, if that's all it was, we wouldn't need to go to therapy. Just stop doing that. That doesn't work, right? And so we need very complex ecologies of practices in order to deal with that self-deceptive behavior. And then they need to be situated within, a valorizing worldview. When you have that, when you have an ecology of practices that's designed to ameliorate that foolishness, that self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, and enhance that connectedness, that meaning in life, right? So to really try and shift so we get a much more of the connectedness and much less of the self-deceptive across in that domain general manner, and that is situated within a tradition and a community that valorizes it with a supportive worldview. That's wisdom. And here's the issue. For various reasons, historical, mostly that I go in this series, are philosophical and cultural history, what has happened is we have lost a worldview that has a proper place and valorizes an ecology of practices for the cultivation of wisdom and the enhancement of meaning. So the predominant worldview is the scientific worldview. And as a cognitive scientist, this is the problem I take as my central task in cognitive science. The scientific worldview has an explanation of everything but how science is possible. So it's got this wonderful explanation of atoms and solar systems and galaxies and even living things and blah, 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 blah. But what about the act of doing science? How do we make that meaning? How do we, because science is a process. We shouldn't confuse science with its claims. Science is a massive ecology of practices for overcoming self-deception. That's what the scientific method, I think, is properly understood. How is it that we are able to do this? To speak of it pictorially, we have this scientific worldview in which we, as meaning makers and as the generators of science, do not have any proper place or home. And so what you're seeing, and what you've been seeing over time, I think it sort of starts in around the 11th century. What you're seeing over time is people increasingly feeling, disconnected from each other, from the world, from themselves even. And so you get a whole bunch of symptoms. We've got the rise in suicide, even suicide independent of clinical depression right now, which is that's a very telling sign. Loneliness epidemic, it's just, right? We have the mental health crisis, which most people are now acknowledging, depression, anxiety disorders. We have the addiction crises, the opioid crises. We have the virtual exodus, people now explicitly declaring that they prefer to live in the virtual world rather than in the real world. And I think that tells you what they're finding, something in that world that's missing from the real world. But you also have what Christopher Massapietro and I call sort of positive responses. You have the mindfulness revolution. You have the revival and growth of Hellenistic wisdom philosophies like Stoicism. What motivated my original series, the attempts by the West, and it's not going great, to try and import Buddhism into Western society. So, and there's a bunch of other things. I'm talking too long, but there's a whole. I've tried to give you the explanation of the symptomology.
It's really helpful, and I think gives us the big picture in a really helpful way, and obviously brings it right up to date